Have you ever wondered why commercial flights steer clear of certain areas of the world? If you've ever taken a long-distance flight, you might have noticed some strange flight paths. One of the most mysterious and debated regions where planes seem to take a detour is the Tibetan Plateau, also known as the roof of the world. But why? Why is this vast and desolate area, surrounded by the highest mountains on Earth, considered off-limits by airlines? At first glance, it might seem odd. The Tibetan Plateau, with its towering peaks and barren landscapes, looks empty, and you'd think it would be a straightforward route for any plane to fly over. Yet, if you look closely at flight paths, you'll notice something unusual. Many flights, especially those that traverse Asia or head from Europe to East Asia, often avoid flying directly over Tibet. But there's more to it than just geographical distance or avoiding the risk of mountain ranges. There's a complex mix of environmental, technical, and even political factors that all play a role. Let's start with the terrain. When you look at the Tibetan Plateau, one of the first things you notice is the sheer height of the mountains. These peaks, like Mount Everest, the tallest in the world, rise to staggering heights, often surpassing 26,000 feet, or over 8 kilometers. For planes cruising at typical altitudes between 30,000 and 40,000 feet, you might think this is no problem. After all, planes are designed to fly high, far above the mountains. But here's the catch. The air at these altitudes is much thinner. The thinner the air, the less lift there is for the plane, making it harder for the aircraft to maintain proper altitude or respond to emergencies if something goes wrong. Let's dig into the physics of flight for a second. Aircraft engines rely on air to function, specifically the oxygen in the air. The higher you go, the less oxygen there is, which can affect both the engine's efficiency and the crew's ability to manage the plane in case of emergency. While modern engines are designed to work in low oxygen environments, there's still a limit. The Tibetan Plateau, being a region that sits at altitudes of around 12,000 feet and higher, creates a unique set of challenges for aircraft flying over it. The thin air means that if a plane has to make an emergency landing or face a malfunction, it may have a harder time managing the situation. Beyond just the physical aspects of the terrain, there's another element at play: the unpredictability of the weather. The Tibetan Plateau is notorious for having extreme and unpredictable weather patterns, which pose significant risks to flying. The area is known for rapid changes in temperature and atmospheric pressure, and these fluctuations can create turbulence that is difficult for pilots to navigate through. Severe winds, sudden storms, and even intense snowfall are common in the region, making it a less than ideal place for aircraft to fly through. The turbulence can be so extreme in some cases that pilots avoid the region altogether when planning their routes. But it's not just about the weather and the terrain. There's also the issue of geography. Tibet's high altitude isn't the only thing that makes it dangerous. The region is extremely remote. If something goes wrong while flying over Tibet, there are few places to land. Imagine being in the middle of a vast plateau with nowhere to safely bring your plane down. This becomes especially concerning when you factor in the mountainous terrain, which makes emergency landings not just difficult, but sometimes impossible. This is why flight planning takes into consideration the possibility of needing to make an emergency landing, or, worse, losing the ability to communicate with air traffic control in the event of a disaster. When you combine the harsh weather conditions, the thin air, and the lack of emergency landing options, it starts to make sense why airlines might choose to avoid this part of the world. It's simply too risky to fly directly over the Tibetan Plateau. However, there's another aspect to this mystery, something that goes beyond the natural challenges of the region. As you might know, Tibet is a politically sensitive area. The region is disputed and under the control of China, and many countries have their own political and diplomatic reasons for avoiding the area. In fact, certain flight paths in and around Tibet are heavily regulated by the Chinese government, and getting approval to fly over these areas isn't always straightforward. For some international airlines, especially those from countries that have tense relations with China, flying over Tibet could be seen as politically contentious. These political considerations can add an additional layer of complexity to flight planning. Some airlines avoid Tibet simply to avoid any diplomatic or legal issues that might arise from flying over a politically sensitive region. Whether it's due to territorial disputes, military zones, or airspace regulations, the political tensions surrounding Tibet can affect how and when airlines choose to fly through or around the area. This political aspect ties into another intriguing fact: the difficulty of monitoring air traffic over Tibet. The region is not only remote, but also has limited infrastructure. In areas where radar coverage is sparse, pilots and air traffic controllers have to rely on more traditional methods of communication, like satellite systems, to track flights. If something goes wrong in a region where radar coverage is minimal, it could be difficult for controllers to assist the plane quickly, further increasing the risks associated with flying over Tibet. You might be wondering, with all these risks, why don't airlines just avoid Tibet altogether by taking longer routes? After all, if it's so dangerous, why not just go around it? In theory, this seems like a good idea, but it's not always that simple. Routes over Tibet are often the most direct paths for flights traveling from Europe to Asia. To avoid the area entirely would mean longer flights, which come with additional fuel costs, longer flight times, and more resources spent on each journey. Airlines, driven by the need to optimize costs and time, have to balance safety with efficiency. So while many flights do avoid Tibet, some still fly over or near the region, especially when it's the most efficient option. Yet, even though airlines often take precautions, accidents involving flights over or near the Tibetan Plateau have occurred in the past. One of the most notable was the crash of Air India Flight 182 in 1950, which crashed into the mountains of the Tibetan Plateau. The wreckage was found in a remote area, and the lack of nearby rescue services made it an incredibly difficult and dangerous recovery operation. This tragedy highlighted just how important it is to be cautious in such challenging and isolated terrain. But here's something even more curious. While most commercial flights avoid Tibet, there are some military flights that regularly fly over the region. Why the difference? It seems that military aircraft are better equipped for the unique challenges that Tibet presents. With advanced technology, emergency protocols, and the ability to handle high-altitude environments, military planes can often navigate Tibet more effectively than commercial planes. But even then, their flights are often carefully planned to avoid the most dangerous areas, and they have the resources to deal with any unexpected situations that might arise. Another interesting factor is the increasing reliance on satellite technology for navigation. While airplanes have traditionally relied on ground-based navigation aids, the rise of satellite systems like GPS has made it easier to navigate even in remote and difficult areas like Tibet. This new technology has allowed airlines to take more direct routes through challenging airspace, but it also comes with its own set of risks and challenges. GPS systems, though advanced, are still susceptible to interference, and any glitches in the system could have serious consequences for a plane flying over Tibet. So, when you really break it down, the reason why planes avoid the Tibet zone isn't just because of one single factor, but a combination of issues. The sheer height of the Tibetan Plateau, the unpredictability of its weather, the lack of emergency landing options, the political complexities, and the challenge of navigating over such a remote and isolated area all contribute to the decision to steer clear of Tibet. While planes can fly over Tibet, the risks involved make it a less than ideal choice for airlines, and as a result, they often choose alternative routes that are safer, more reliable, and easier to navigate. But it's not just the airlines that are cautious. Even pilots who fly over or near Tibet have to be extra careful. They undergo rigorous training to understand the unique challenges of high-altitude flight and how to manage the risks associated with flying in such an extreme environment. These pilots are prepared for everything, from sudden turbulence to unexpected changes in air pressure, and they know how to handle the situation if something goes wrong. As you can see, the reason why planes avoid the Tibet zone is a complex mix of environmental, technical, and political factors. While it might seem like a simple decision at first glance, there are many hidden layers to why certain flight paths go around the Tibetan Plateau rather than over it. Whether it's the challenging terrain, the unpredictable weather, the lack of landing options, or the political sensitivities, there's no one simple explanation. But one thing is clear: when it comes to flying, safety always comes first. Airlines, pilots, and air traffic controllers must carefully weigh the risks and make decisions that keep everyone on board as safe as possible. The next time you're on a flight, take a moment to look out the window and wonder, what's going on up there? And remember, some of the most mysterious and challenging places on Earth, like Tibet, might just be more complicated to navigate than we ever imagined. The skies above may look vast and open, but for those who fly, they're filled with hidden dangers and decisions that we may never fully understand. So, the next time you see a flight path that takes a strange detour around Tibet, you'll know the truth. It's not just about mountains. It's about the delicate balance between technology, nature, and the unpredictable world that lies below. Do subscribe Universal Infactus for more interesting videos.